This is Carl Ackerman, host of Journeys of the Mind under that fine ThinkTech rubric. And today we have Josh Vanek from Montana, and he is the lead for the campus network for Civic Engagement. Hello, Josh.
Yeah, hello, Carl. Good afternoon and good morning there.
Absolutely. The time difference shows between Hawaii and Montana. So, the first question I have for you is something personal because, I noticed on your resume that you are second generation Peace Corps. And since we're talking about civic engagement, that engagement into this sort of open space of politics, um, tell us about this. This is remarkable.
My parents met each other in Liberia in the early 70s as Peace Corps volunteers. It was always a conversation in our household. It was a big part of their lives, and they were part of, the ask not what your country can do for you, I think, generation that really, had that civic spirit about it. And it's a proud part of their, who they are. And so I grew up hearing about Monrovia, and my dad taught law school, and all the fellow PCVs that they knew and kept in contact with, and that we, whose whose spare rooms we stayed in when we were traveling growing up. So it was always a big part of my life, that experience for them, and clearly, no Peace Corps, no Josh, in the grand scheme of things. So I went to college in the 90s at UM at the University of Montana in Missoula, where I presently am located and where our offices are. I got a political science degree and, had a general interest in, doing good and wanting to pursue work in that, but didn't really have a clear idea beyond that, other than I wanted to kind of challenge myself and do something different than be in our country. And service with Peace Corps was really enticing to me, I think, because of what I had heard from my folks growing up, as it, just being a life-changing thing. So yeah, I was trying to think of what made me interesting when we were talking earlier, and I pulled that out, second generation Peace Corps volunteer. And so I ended up in Latvia and lived there for a little over 2 years and taught English in the late 90s.
You were there then, after the Soviet Union had experienced its fall. And so, what was it like in terms of civic engagement in Latvia at the time?
We talked a lot about how the concept of volunteerism had definitely had some Soviet baggage, some kind of pioneer youth movement baggage associated with it. And the Latvian word for volunteer is brīvprātīgais darbinieks. I remember it because it's a tongue twister, and it basically means um, free-minded worker, uh, or something like that. And it was definitely, the idea that there's you know a nonprofit sector, or that there's a civil society, a place where people are not being compensated but doing it for the public good, and really wanting to see a part of society that is where good things happen, where we take care of people, where we, see arts and culture spaces, and was really emerging. And I think Peace Corps was a big part of that, and they really encouraged us to say, like, that we're unlearning a lot of things from our past, including how the rest of the world does this, and how we don't simply have this central authority that we kind of answer to, but we are very local in terms of what do we need in Ventspils, Latvia. So it was, I think I was lucky to be there as things were changing, and you know, see, Latvians are amazing, in terms of what they've done since they regained independence, and a big part of that is just rebuilding. I think a lot of what was really kind of held back and squashed during the years that as Latvians would say, they were occupied.
Just so our viewers will know, when you mention the pioneers, you're talking about the young pioneers and the Boy Scouts. That's equivalent to their Boy Scouts. I imagine some of our audience was thinking, "Oh yes, Latvia must have gone and conquered someplace in their west." But pioneers in the sense of the old Soviet model of youth joining this Boy Scout organizations, pledging their allegiance to both Lenin and Stalin and people like this. So
Like,
anyway,
yes.
but
So thank you for
no,
catching
no,
the.
no. I use that term often too, because as a Russianist. So let me ask you about the word civic engagement and most specifically how you're encouraging kids in Montana and broadly across universities because of your connections there. But in Montana, what do you mean by civic engagement, and what do you try to get kids to do? Kids meaning college kids.
So I work for a network of colleges across the state, ranging from 2-year, 4-year, regional schools to our flagship universities and private institutions. We also are really rich in that we have 7 tribally controlled colleges in Montana. And so we're pretty diverse in terms of what a college student looks like, and the idea of a traditional college student has changed substantially, and I think they're just on average folks are older, working in many cases, and so when we think about civic engagement, I tend to I've done an exercise with AmeriCorps members and college students in the past where we talk about this spectrum of activities that falls within, you know, it's not purely, voting, seeking public office, supporting a campaign, doing policy work. It's also small things like, taking part in a community cleanup that perhaps can, lend that sense of agency that eventually spur you to say, you know what, I really care about uh, our schools, and I want to see greater investment and want to make sure our schools are as great as can be, and I'm going to be a school board member. I really we think a lot of it in terms of the higher ed work as providing pathways to people so that um, through perhaps even small service opportunities, volunteer opportunities, perhaps a summer AmeriCorps term, folks can get a taste of what it's like to work in the public good, to do something that is about making our communities and our society more inclusive, more equitable, less polluting perhaps. you know Hesitate to use the broad brushstrokes of better, but that kind of work that lifts up and addresses public issues. And so I think of it really as in addition to clearly the voting side of things and the issue advocacy and the sort of political side of civic engagement, all of which is enormously important, as there being like lots of entry points to that. And higher ed, I think, is really attuned to um, students come to education for lots of different reasons. Central among them is, how do I find employment that in most cases that sets me up for economic success. And I think some of the tension we sometimes feel in this work is we want to really view higher ed as being a a good in and of itself, a just a we are pursuing education because that is clearly a noble cause. But students also show up with very practical, you know, uh, dreams in mind. Wanting to be employed in something that they care about, wanting to get a job that they can rely on and that allows them to, purchase a home perhaps, and you know set aside some savings. And I really think that one of the cool things that we see in higher ed is the understanding that through internships, through service positions, through curricular service learning, et cetera, through work study positions, through one-off service Saturdays. We have through clubs, we have all kinds of ways to demonstrate to students what it means to be part of community and to contribute to society. So it's pretty exciting.
I think this is very exciting work. And is there a problem right now promoting civic engagement, as you define it, with your quite interesting students? Um, because it seems to be nationally, people are focused on what's in it for them. It seems like we have a national lead in terms of politics, that's going towards, Bitcoin and, looking at the stock market only. And
Yeah.
that seems to be sort of the opposite of what you're doing. And also, how do your students feel about, that term DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion? Because, from my perspective, it's, it seems to be the civic, you're in the civic world. And I think it's just sort of being polite and listening to other people. But, I don't know how you feel about that.
We're in a time of absolutely a rapid change, and I do think our country has a lot of momentum behind this idea that we're people that talk about real issues. We're trying to iterate a more inclusive democracy, and you know I view it in some ways as kind of like the United States is a large ship, and it takes a lot to turn that thing. And while we may be in a movement or in a moment where and maybe this is a little uh, naive of me, but that we're many of us are really kind of like frankly just horrified at some of the examples that we hear from our top leadership in our country. um, I think there's enough of a history and I was listening to my news podcast this morning, reminding me that, um, Lincoln was a Republican. That party was created to abolish slavery. And it's interesting to think about how things shift over time. So, you know, I'm hopeful. I think a big part of what we do in this work is to bring hope and to represent, how people are making a difference. Even if it's on a very small scale and a grassroots level, we're constantly hearing examples of students that go out of their way to volunteer their time, to set up nonprofits, to give back in very substantial and time intensive ways. So I'm lucky that I get to hear about these things, and I do. I have a lot of hope for our future, even if we are in a moment rather that does seem to be changing pretty rapidly. On the subject of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I mean, I failed to see what is controversial about those three words and the acronym DEI. It seems really, you know, I think our country has a pretty powerful history of making attempts throughout its history to right some of the wrongs uh, you know that have been part of our history. And I lived through the backlash of political correctness. I see this as similar. I think what happens oftentimes is this is discomfort is what comes with real conversations about how are we more inclusive, how do we acknowledge and celebrate diversity, how do we work to be more equitable. And if you're a white man, part of dominant society, you're probably more used to getting your way and people deferring to you and your perceived expertise on things than many other classes of people. And I think it's important that you know, we that those of us that have privilege do acknowledge it and look at how we do better as a country. So to me, I don't I'm not scared by folks talking about racism or um, needing to think deeply about how do we address things. I think these conversations are hard, and oftentimes when people are called out on behaviors or language they use, that's uncomfortable. And I think a lot of the backlash we're currently experiencing is the product of discomfort. And I think our country is a place that will iterate better, and the pendulum will swing. But I don't know. To me, it's certainly not noise. I mean, these things have been quickly removed from you know pretty successful movement to change our the higher ed sector, and it's really intentional work to be more inclusive in the past year. So I don't say any of this lightly, but I do think it's important for us to hold our ground and say, higher ed has always been a place at its best that does go out of its way to say, look, we are about opportunity. We're about people using education to advance themselves and to, you know, do more of what they're capable of. And we pride ourselves on our, being accessible and, um, and seeing people for who they are and acknowledging difference. And so I think um, I'm hopeful about that too, because I do think it's important that our country not only discuss and get into the details of these things, you know, in a major way, but also sit with some of that discomfort rather than just say, "Oh no, our narrative is about American exceptionalism," or how currently I look at the example of some of our national monuments and parks where tribal nations are suing the federal government because they essentially have had their histories erased from those spaces. And I don't think that's an improvement. I think people need to know what happened at the Battle of Greasy Grass or Little Bighorn, and I don't think reshaping the narrative so that the United States is always kind of cast in a positive light helps anybody. It does not. I don't think it helps our country. I think we're strong because we look at our history whole cloth and are comfortable with saying when we were wrong. And so I don't know.
Josh, I think you would be a wonderful historian because, I mean, you can't always, history is a complicated issue, and you have to include all parts of your history. You can't pick and choose what you want to put into it. It's this it's if you're really after the truth includes a lot of things that are quite messy, and
Mm.
so you need to discuss it. Now, can you give us sort of on a micro level? Examples of your students doing service, and do they do that wonderful in your experience and what you do in terms of your work with students? Do they do that fantastic job of reflecting on their um, on their work that they've done in terms of civic engagement or volunteerism?
I've been doing work in this specific field. I worked for Montana Campus Compact when I returned from Peace Corps in Latvia, and so I've been in this work for about 26 years, and heavily in our early days, my early days with this work. We were working heavily with faculty members and talking about how they could adopt service learning pedagogy as a teaching method that gave students not only real world experience, but this opportunity to think about real world problems, their place in it. And reflection was basically what set this apart from pure volunteerism and brought a lot of the learning home. So it's huge in it. On a micro level, we we support a handful of things that I'm really proud of. We have the College Leaders Cohort, a program where we provide micro grants to students so that it's very much turning over agency as much as we can to our students across the state so that they can put together a service project that involves their fellow students. And so at Great Falls College, MSU, which is about 200 miles east, it's a 2-year school, an awesome place in central Montana. Um, we had two of their student government um, members who took that little bit of kind of seed money from us for the in the form of that micro grant and turned it into a bigger set of donations so that you know these very working class student peers of theirs who perhaps couldn't afford a turkey at Thanksgiving or a nice Christmas meal could get that. So it was really this, I think, this cool act of just trying to bring maybe something that was out of reach for the average student there more available. And I think a part of that and what they do in student government is very reflective because they're at the level of their peers. They're looking around. They see people who are struggling with high costs of living and pretty flat wages, and know that, gosh, if it's important to mark a holiday and to have something special, and I really took a lot of inspiration from that, and I think it does seem like that using reflection to kind of like after the fact draw lessons and think a little bit more deeply about like, okay, that was a one-time thing. Maybe what do we take for motivation from this, or what did we learn from this? Is hugely motivating because um, it does offer you know students and participants to take that service experience and kind of revisit it and think about how it lines up with their own values, and perhaps use it as a way to make a plan for continuing to be involved. I think is often the trick that we try to sink the hook, is to say, look, you got a chance to give back. How did that feel? What did you notice? What's next? These are good questions, and I think it's exciting to see students making use of them and getting motivated.
It goes back to the initial motivating factor that obviously struck you about President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who talked about, not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, which is, sort of the opposite of what's going on today.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you a little bit more about what you were talking about just now about kids being more sober in terms of their reflection, because I just watched uh, a podcast that dealt with uh, nuclear weapons and things like this. And the way I'm drawing this in is it mentioned, leaders who talk about, uh, using nuclear weapons in their, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin come to mind. And I'm wondering whether service learning has an additional benefit of not allowing, I mean, or inspiring kids to be more judicious in the way not only they talk in general, but talk to each other and to society at large, because they become more comfortable with the civic sphere and realize that their words have impact. As Martin Malia from the UC Berkeley would say, that that words mean something.
I did not expect that we would be reliving kind of some Cold War, nuclear saber rattling in 2025, 2026, and before. I think the Ukraine invasion has brought back some, really really negative, uh, you know, facets of our, international relations, and something that I had hoped that we had learned lessons from and had moved past. But, you know, um, yeah, I do hope that folks are thinking on that global scale when they think about their work locally, and they're thinking about, gosh, what exactly are these things for? There is this real, I don't know. It's interesting, it's an interesting time we're in. The Department of Defense, been renamed the Department of War, so it's almost an open acknowledgement that this is just an inevitability. And folks that, you know, I guess there's a realpolitik about this that just says there's going to be well-armed people with awful ideas who want to, expand their countries, always. And the best way to address that is to be well armed yourself, and that's a defensive posture. And really, that, you that's how you ensure peace. I struggle because I'm not positive how exactly I reconcile all of that. I think I've benefited from a country that's, been kind of like the leader of NATO, and is incredibly well armed, and has meant that I've grown up not needing to think about being drafted, and not being, um, have anybody, attempting to, I guess we lived through September 11th, so there are certainly major caveats to this. But I think of mostly what my 51 years have been like, and it's, I haven't had to think about fighting another country, joining the military on a personal level. So I think in many ways, we're privileged in that way. But I also think we need to continue pushing and asking deeper questions about, you know, what is the end game of this, arming ourselves in this way. And, when do we restart the talks? Because honestly, mutually assured destruction is something that will keep most of us up at night. And it's not something that I think anybody, regardless of your personal politics, is interested in. It doesn't, um, it's deeply troubling to think about, missiles aimed at your country. Montana is home to many intercontinental ballistic missiles. And on one hand, it makes us a target. On the other, perhaps it makes us safe. I wish there was another way to think about our safety, and to engage with our enemies in a way that, didn't tie up so many resources in this incredibly costly, nuclear proliferation that seems like we're back into.
You're doing your part by having students think about service and becoming more sober and serving other people, which is, I think part of the process of getting people to be careful with their words. So that you're doing a great job. And in that light, I understand not this year, 2026, but 2027, you're one of the leads with another wonderful woman named Alexis, in terms of a great woman, in terms of sponsoring a conference that's going to be over the Western region. And can you describe that? Because it's people across the Western region of the United States encouraging their students to do service learning in a conference on their behalf, so to speak.
I'm part of a coalition of states that have some kind of a network. So here in Montana, we're 18 colleges. I think we work with Lead California, Peace, which is the Pacific Education Alliance for Community Engagement, and your awesome colleague, Atina Pasqua, um, the Washington Campus Coalition for the Public Good. And then we have partners in Utah, who have kept a loose group of folks who are involved in the civic engagement, service learning space. And we have, over the past, I want to say, just about 20 years or 20 plus, every 2 years put together a conference that's called the Continuums of Service. Our last one was last year and at Seattle University. And the year, 2 years before that, it was in Honolulu. And we did visits to Kapiolani Community College and University Manoa partners, nonprofits, public housing. Incredible opportunity to kind of see that partnership work where higher ed and community organizations and agencies come together. So in March of 2027, we are prepping for our next continuums of service, and we are just in the midst of experiencing a potential location shift. And so we thought we had a location buttoned down, but it looks like we're likely going to have to go back to the drawing board pretty quickly on that. But I'm positive that we're going to land somewhere amazing, and there's just great. It's a really interesting conference because I think it pulls together folks who are practitioners, who are doing the work, whether they're student. We have a student led track to this that is very much about um, student community engagement, and it's not the older folks kind of telling them what it ought to be, but it's we turn over the keys to our students for their track, so they're pulling in the examples and the conversations and the sessions that they want to see. Um, yeah, and we're really framing the theme of this 2027 event in terms of, I think, what you were alluding to earlier, this crossroads we seem to be at, where all of a sudden, at the national level, we see a real currency around this very kind of selfish posture that says, look, you got to get yours. It's okay to be a billionaire. It's, go forth and, rob and plunder, I guess. And I think our work, I- you know, it, I think it acknowledges the fact that community is kind of really one of the pillars of the American experience. And if we're not careful about kind of shepherding that, you know, we have a lot of history that we can, you know, that that we potentially can lose. So yeah, this conference is amazing. It's going to be in the inland west somewhere, potentially Montana, but we need to work out some details for that. We had planned on it being in the state of Utah, but some of these recent personnel changes may mean that we can't pull it off there. Um, so yeah, that's save the date, March of 2027.
I assume people can call you or email you
Oh
or
yeah.
at your consortium. What's the best email? Say it slowly that where people can contact you.
Yeah, my last name is Vanek, so V as in Victor, Anek at mtengage.org.
That's not too difficult of an email to
Not too
follow.
bad. No.
So my last question today is simply this one. I always liked reading, and I've read it 3 times, Democracy in America by Tocqueville. And he, as a Frenchman in the mid 19th century, really talks about all the different civic organizations that define America. And do you think that's true today? I mean, despite the what's going on at the national level in politics and President Trump, do you think it's still true today that we have this kind of we're defined in our democracy by all these smaller um, civic groups that Tocqueville, as a Frenchman, was just amazed at? I mean, he went on and on. People come together, they're small groups, and they do all these things that but do you think it's still true today, especially from your perspective living in Montana?
I think there are examples of really amazing grassroots civic spaces that very much are still a part of society, and I think they do still exist. I mean, I think of even the voluntary associations of student groups at a college or university, and those are people who say, "Look, we have some kind of shared interest. Typically, there's a public benefit to that. They'll do something that is awareness raising for their cause. um you know Whether that's physical activity or neurodiversity awareness, or I go back to some positives. So I do think there are real examples, and I look at higher ed as a good place to find them. I mean, I think Robert Putnam's uh, study of this tells us that it is on the decline. That the voluntary associations that we have such as at the bowling alley, where we're just simply letting our hair down together, and you know regardless of our differences in our work or our politics or our etc., we can just be humans together. And that he looked at bowling leagues and noticed that there are fewer of them, and that is an indicator of some of this receding a little bit. um so I'm Yeah, I mean, I do get concerned that that there is some change. I think we're increasingly, this technology that we're currently using is in some ways amazing. For very little in the way of resources, you and I can talk across, three time zones, and how many thousands of miles, real time. It's brilliant. But there's also two screens between us, so the warmth of kind of human togetherness is trickier to come by. But um, yeah, I don't know. I do see a lot of good examples, and I do think that people um, are still getting together because they care about public issues, and they find ways to be part of nonprofit organizations or boards, or they volunteer. And I live in a state that has a pretty solid, um, ranks relatively highly. I think Utah is actually among the highest in the country for participation. And I think you brought up um, the Church of Latter-day Saints as an example of an institution that places a high value on that service. I think churches and religious organizations are a good example of people coming together to do good and to address real issues in their communities. And I think there are other examples of that, but I don't think it's any time to be asleep at the wheel. I think if you care about it, it's good. It's a good motivation to say, like, not only do I care about it, but I'm going to show up and, at least listen to what goes on at that meeting and see if I am moved to talk or get involved with this organization.
That's a fine conclusion, and I wanted to say I think that was that book by Putnam, Bowling Alone. Was that the title? That's a great book. I remember reading it
It
years
is,
ago.
yeah. It's now, I think, 25 years old, but
Yeah,
it's amazing for this kind of work, and it does definitely kind of motivate you if you have a look at it. Compared to the real expansive nature of civic organizations. When he started the research, and how he just documents the decline. It can't help but kind of get you fired up a little bit.
I will leave you with this one image. Here in Hawaii, we have a homeless shelter called the Institute for Human Services that was started, as you just mentioned, by an Episcopal priest, Father Detil, many, many years ago. But I took my students when I was still teaching at Punahou School in a class called Contemporary Hawaiian Issues. We went almost every weekend for an entire semester and painted a huge mural together with the words Ikomo Mai, which in Hawaiian means welcome. and it was on the men's shelter garage wall, which it remains on that wall today. And I think that experiences like that for students where they're serving others, doing good work, as you do with your entire life and your coalition of, of universities, you do this on a daily basis, Josh. And I'm going to leave you with the last word before we sign off today.
I appreciate you inviting me to your conversation, Carl, and am inspired to hear about what's going on in Hawaii, and really thank you for shining a spotlight on, I think, the great work going on in higher ed. I think sometimes we don't toot our own horn loudly enough. We're sort of in the trenches of making stuff happen. So I encourage everybody to kind of dig around if this is something that student civic engagement, volunteerism, service learning, community involvement, broadly speaking, are things that um, motivate you. I think seek it out, because we love getting help from community members, and there's really amazing opportunities for students in higher ed these days to not only to learn and grow in their disciplines, but to understand more about who they are as citizens and community members.
Ah, yes, citizens who serve. This is a great comment, Josh. We leave today after hearing from Josh Vanek, and I think it's fair to say that Alexis Tocqueville, if he were living in the 21st century, would say Josh Vanek is a mensch, or a very good person. So that's the way we'll end today. And this is Carl Ackerman, host of Journeys of the Mind, under that rubric Think Tech Hawaii. And Josh, I'll add one last thing, and that is, if you want to see a good analysis of what's going on in terms of nuclear weapons, go to the podcast that was recently made by Josh Fidel and his guest. That was a really wonderful podcast that maybe asked that question of you about kids thinking more in a more sober light. Anyway, we're signing off. Again, Carl Ackerman, host of Journeys of the Mind, a hui ho and aloha.